I'm Maya Rodriguez, 28, and I watched my brother Derek destroy 3 years of blood, sweat and tears in less than 60 seconds. The grand opening of my boutique marketing agency was supposed to be my triumph. The moment I proved to everyone that the girl who barely graduated high school could build something extraordinary. Instead, it became the night I discovered my golden boy brother's dirty little secret and decided to serve him the revenge he deserved on a silver platter in front of 200 guests. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of October 15th started like any fairy tale. I woke up in my cramped studio apartment, sunlight streaming through the single window that overlooked the parking lot of my building. Today was the day. After 3 years of working 18-hour days, eating ramen noodles for dinner more nights than I cared to count, and maxing out every credit card I owned, Rodriguez Creative Solutions was finally ready to show the world what we could do. I'd invited everyone who mattered. My parents, who still looked at me with that mixture of confusion and concern whenever I talked about my business. My college friends who'd watched me transform from party girl to workaholic entrepreneur. Local business owners, potential clients, and even some industry bigwigs I'd managed to connect with through sheer determination and probably too many LinkedIn messages. The venue was perfect. A converted warehouse in the arts district that I'd decorated with string lights and succulents, trying to capture that trendy startup vibe on a budget that would make most people laugh. But it was mine, and it was beautiful, and I was so proud I could barely contain myself. Derek had called me 3 days earlier, his voice carrying that familiar tone of big brother concern, mixed with what I'd always interpreted as love. Maya, I'm so proud of you, little sister. This whole business thing, it's really impressive. I'll definitely be there on Friday. I should have known something was wrong. Derek never called me little sister unless he was about to ask for something or felt guilty about something. But I was so caught up in the excitement of finally having his approval that I missed all the warning signs. My brother Derek had always been the golden child in our family. 2 years older than me, valedictorian of his high school class, full scholarship to Stanford, MBA from Wharton. He worked for one of those prestigious consulting firms downtown, the kind where everyone wears $1,000 suits and talks about synergy and disruption while making more money in a month than most people see in a Marn. Yeah. Growing up, I was the screw-up. The one who got suspended for skipping class, who barely passed chemistry, who changed her major 3 times in college before finally settling on communications with a focus I wasn't even sure I understood. My parents never said it out loud, but I knew they wondered where they went wrong with me, while Derek collected academic awards and job offers like trading cards. That's what made building my business so important. For the first time in my life, I was doing something that mattered, something that was mine. I'd started Rodriguez Creative Solutions in my bedroom, working with local small businesses who needed help with their social media and marketing but couldn't afford the big agencies. Word of mouth spread, clients started referring other clients, and suddenly I had more work that I could handle alone. I hired my first employee, then my second. We moved into a real office space, a tiny converted retail shop that cost more per month than my rent, but it had windows and a proper conference room and a sign out front with my name on it. My name. After 28 years of being the disappointment, the afterthought, the one everyone worried about, I was finally somebody. The grand opening was supposed to be my moment to show everyone, especially my family, that I wasn't the screw-up they thought I was. I'd spent weeks preparing, reaching out to local media, designing invitation cards that looked professional enough to belong in Derek's world, practicing my speech until I could deliver it without my voice shaking. I arrived at the venue 3 hours early, my stomach a knot of excitement and terror. My assistant Jenna was already there, setting up the registration table and arranging the catered food I'd splurged on. Tiny sandwiches and fancy cheese that cost more than my grocery budget for a month but seemed necessary for the image I was trying to project. "You look amazing," Jenna said, and I did feel amazing. I'd bought a new dress for the occasion, navy blue and professional, but with a cut that made me feel confident and powerful. My hair was styled in loose waves that had taken 2 hours and 3 YouTube tutorials to achieve, and I was wearing makeup that actually made me look like I knew what I was doing. The first guests started arriving at 6:30, fashionably late by 30 minutes, and I felt that familiar surge of panic that maybe nobody would come, that this whole thing was a mistake, that I was just the same screw-up I'd always been, now with business cards and a website. But they did come. My college roommate Sarah showed up with her husband and 2 kids, taking pictures of everything and posting them on social media with captions about supporting women entrepreneurs. My neighbor Mrs. Patterson came, bringing her sister and 3 friends who all wanted to know about my services for their Bridge Club's fundraiser. Local business owners I'd been courting for months walked through the door, looking impressed by the setup and asking intelligent questions about our service offerings. My parents arrived at 7, my mother clutching her purse like a shield and looking around the space with the same expression she used to wear when visiting my college dorm room, like she was trying to figure out how something so chaotic could possibly work. My father, bless him, was more enthusiastic, shaking hands with everyone he met and introducing himself as Maya's dad, with a pride in his voice that made my chest tight. "Where's Derek?" my mother asked, checking her phone for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "He said he'd be here by now." I glanced at my own phone. 7:15, and no messages from my brother. But I wasn't worried yet. Derek was always busy, always juggling client calls and meetings that ran late. He'd show up, probably with some story about traffic or a last-minute crisis at work, and everything would be fine. By 7:30, the space was packed. More people had come than I'd expected. The registration table was covered with business cards and contact information sheets, and I could hear the buzz of conversation and laughter that meant people were actually enjoying themselves. I was starting to relax, to believe that maybe I'd actually pulled this off, when I spotted Derek near the entrance. He wasn't alone. Derek had brought a woman with him, someone I'd never seen before, tall and blonde with the kind of effortless style that probably cost more than my monthly office rent. She was wearing a little black dress that looked like it came from the kind of boutique where they serve champagne while you shop, and she had her arm looped through Derek's like they belonged together. But that wasn't what made my stomach drop. It was the expression on Derek's face, a combination of amusement and something else, something that looked almost like contempt as he surveyed my little party. He was dressed in one of his expensive suits, the kind that made him look like he belonged in boardrooms and country clubs, and next to him, my carefully planned event suddenly felt small and trying too hard. I made my way over to greet them, pasting on my biggest smile and preparing to play the gracious hostess. But Derek's first words stopped me cold. "Maya, this is interesting," he said, his voice carrying just a little too clearly over the crowd noise. "Very, very interesting setup you have here." The way he said interesting made it sound like a criticism, like he was commenting on a child's art project that was cute but ultimately pointless. The blonde woman beside him smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes and extended a perfectly manicured hand. "I'm Victoria," she said. "Derek's told me so much about you." I shook her hand, trying to read the subtext in her tone, trying to figure out why Derek's presence felt more like a threat than support. "It's nice to meet you. I didn't know Derek was bringing anyone."
"Last-minute addition," Derek said, his eyes scanning the room like he was taking inventory.
"Victoria's in marketing too, corporate level. I thought she might find this amusing." Amusing. There was that word again, loaded with implications that made my cheeks burn. But before I could respond, my mother appeared at my elbow, her face lighting up at the sight of her golden boy. "Derek, there you are. And who is this lovely young lady?" The introductions continued, Derek playing the charming son role he'd perfected over the years, while Victoria nodded and smiled at all the right moments. But I could see her looking around the space with the same expression Derek had worn when he walked in, like she was studying something quaint and slightly pathetic. I excused myself to check on the catering, but really I needed a moment to breathe and figure out why Derek's presence was making me feel like I was 12 years old again, standing in his shadow while adults praised his latest achievement and offered me consoling smiles. Jenna found me by the food table, pretending to rearrange the cheese and crackers that were already perfectly arranged. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice low enough that nearby guests couldn't hear. "Fine," I said, but even I could hear how unconvincing it sounded. "Just tired. Big day. Your brother seems intense," Jenna said diplomatically. She'd been working for me for 8 months, long enough to know that family dynamics were complicated, but professional enough not to pry. "That's one way to put it." I was about to explain, or try to, when I heard Derek's voice rising above the general conversation noise. He was standing near the center of the room, Victoria still attached to his arm, talking to a small group that included my parents and several potential clients I'd been hoping to impress. "The thing about boutique agencies," Derek was saying, his tone conversational but carrying clearly across the room. "Is that great for small local businesses that don't have the budget for real marketing firms? It's like, if you can't afford a real restaurant, you go to a food truck. Same concept." The comparison hit me like a physical blow. Food truck. Like my business was some second-rate alternative for people who couldn't afford the real thing. Like everything I'd built was just a consolation prize. But it got worse. "Maya's always been creative," Derek continued, and I could hear the patronizing affection in his voice, the tone adults use when talking about a child's finger painting. "Even when we were kids, she was always coming up with these elaborate schemes and projects. Remember that summer she tried to start a dog-walking business, Mom? She made flyers and everything, but she forgot that most of our neighbors didn't have dogs." The group laughed, the kind of polite laughter that people offer when someone's telling a story that's supposed to be charming but mostly just feels uncomfortable. My mother joined in, nodding along like this was a fond family memory, instead of Derek systematically undermining everything I'd worked for. "I think it's wonderful that she's found a way to turn that creative energy into something profitable," Victoria added, her voice carrying the kind of professional warmth that barely concealed condescension. "Small businesses are so important to the local economy." Small businesses. Local economy. Every word was carefully chosen to emphasize limitations, to make my company sound like a neighborhood lemonade stand instead of the growing agency I'd built from nothing. I felt my hands clenching into fists at my sides, my carefully applied makeup probably showing the strain as my jaw tightened. This was supposed to be my night. My moment. And Eric was turning it into another opportunity to remind everyone that he was the successful one. The one with the real job, and the important clients, and the sophisticated girlfriend who probably made more in a year than I'd see in 5. But I couldn't make a scene. Not here. Not with all these people watching. Not when I was supposed to be the professional businesswoman who had her life together. So I smiled and joined the conversation, playing along with Derek's performance, while internally planning his demise. Actually, I said, stepping into the circle with my best confident smile, we're expanding pretty rapidly. We just signed 3 new clients this month, including Henderson Manufacturing. Henderson Manufacturing was a big deal locally, the kind of established company that legitimized smaller firms by association. I'd been courting them for 6 months, and landing them had been a major victory. But Derek barely acknowledged the accomplishment. That's great, Maya. Really great. Local manufacturing, right? Victoria works with Fortune 500 companies. Global campaigns, multinational product launches, the real high-stakes stuff. And there it was again. The dismissal disguised as encouragement. The way Derek had always managed to make my achievements feel small by comparison. I wanted to scream, to point out that I built something from nothing while he'd walked into his job through family connections and an Ivy League network. But I couldn't. Not here. Not now. The evening continued, and Derek's performance became more elaborate. He told stories about his work, name-dropping clients and projects that sounded important and complicated. He offered unsolicited advice about my business model, suggesting changes that would make it more like his company, more corporate, more legitimate. He introduced Victoria to everyone as his girlfriend, emphasizing her impressive credentials and high-level position, like they reflected on him. And through it all, I smiled and nodded and played the grateful little sister who was lucky to have such a successful brother looking out for her interests. That something was building inside me, a pressure that started in my chest and spread through my entire body like carbonation in a shaken bottle. Every patronizing comment, every dismissive glance, every time Derek managed to redirect attention from my accomplishments to his own was adding to that pressure. The breaking point came during my speech. I'd planned to speak at 8:30, after most people had arrived, and had a chance to mingle and see the space. I'd practiced this speech dozens of times, in front of my bathroom mirror, to Jenna during lunch breaks, even to my cat, Mr. Whiskers, who served as a surprisingly attentive audience. The speech was supposed to be about vision and community and the power of small businesses to create real change in people's lives. I wanted to talk about the clients I'd helped, the local entrepreneurs who'd grown their businesses with our support. The way marketing could be more than just selling products. It could be about building connections and telling, quote, stories that mattered. I was 3 sentences in when Derek's phone rang. Not vibrated. Rang. Loudly. With a ringtone that sounded like a mashup of corporate elevator music and self-importance. In the middle of my speech, in front of 200 people, Derek answered his phone. Sorry, he said. Not to me, but to the person calling. I'm at my sister's little event. Can I call you back in 20 minutes? Little event. Those 2 words hung in the air like a slap. Around me, I could see faces turning from polite attention to awkward discomfort as they realized what had just happened. My parents looked mortified. Victoria looked like she was trying to disappear into her designer dress. And Derek looked completely oblivious to the fact that he'd just humiliated me in front of everyone who mattered. But she wasn't done. Actually, you know what? Derek said into his phone, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent room. Let me just step outside. This is probably going to be important, and honestly, I think Maya's got this covered. She's always been good at this entertaining stuff. My business, my life's work, my moment of triumph, reduced to entertaining stuff. Derek walked toward the exit, still talking on his phone, leaving behind a room full of people who didn't know where to look or what to say. I stood at the front of the room, my carefully prepared speech forgotten, watching my brother dismiss everything I'd worked for as casually as someone switching off a television show they weren't enjoying. That's when the pressure inside me finally reached its breaking point. But instead of exploding, something cold and calculating settled over me. Standing there in front of my guests, watching Derek's retreating figure, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to destroy him. Not physically, not illegally, but completely and thoroughly, and in front of everyone who had just witnessed him humiliate me. Because in that moment, watching him walk away from my dreams, like they were nothing more than a minor inconvenience, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. Derek wasn't the golden boy everyone thought he was. Golden boys don't treat their sisters like that. Golden boys don't show up to family events just to prove their superiority. Golden boys don't bring their girlfriends to their sister's business opening as props in their own performance. Which meant Derek was hiding something. And I was going to find out what it was. I finished my speech, managing to pull together something coherent about community and support and the future of Rodriguez Creative Solutions. The applause was enthusiastic, warmer than it might have been if people hadn't just witnessed Derek's performance and felt sorry for me. Sometimes sympathy works better than admiration. Derek returned 20 minutes later, looking pleased with himself and completely unaware that he'd just declared war on the wrong person. He rejoined the group around my parents, picking up conversations like nothing had happened, charming and confident and utterly convinced of his own importance. I spent the rest of the evening playing hostess, thanking people for coming, exchanging business cards, and making plans for follow-up meetings. But part of my attention was always on Derek, watching him, studying him, looking for cracks in his perfect facade, and I found them. Derek was nervous about something. He checked his phone constantly, but not in the casual, absent way most people do. He was watching for specific messages, specific calls. When his phone buzzed with notifications, he'd glance at the screen with an expression that looked almost like panic before schooling his features back into casual confidence. Victoria noticed too. I watched her watching him, saw the way her perfect smile tightened when he ignored her to check his messages, the way her laugh became a little too bright when he cut her off mid-sentence to answer a text. There were other things. Derek had always been impeccably groomed, but tonight there was something almost aggressive about his appearance, like he was trying too hard to project success. His watch was new, something expensive and flashy that he kept adjusting on his wrist. His shoes were perfectly polished, but I noticed scuff marks that suggested he'd been doing more walking than someone with his job typically did. And then there was the money. When the bartender came around asking about payment for the evening's drinks, Derek immediately pulled out a roll of cash that was thick enough to choke a horse. Not credit cards, not the company card I knew he carried, but actual physical cash. Hundreds and hundreds of dollars in 20s and 50s, like he was some kind of old-school gangster instead of a management consultant. "Don't worry about it," he told me when I started to object. "My treat. Consider it an investment in your future success." The condescension was bad enough, but the cash was what really caught my attention. Derek had always been careful with money. The kind of person who tracked every expense and maximized every tax deduction. Carrying that much cash was completely out of character, unless he had reasons for wanting transactions that couldn't be traced. By 10 o'clock, most of the guests had left, taking business cards and promises to stay in touch. My parents were among the last to go, my mother hugging me with genuine pride and my father shaking his head in amazement at how well everything had gone. "I'm so proud of you, mija," he said, using the Spanish endearment he'd called me since I was little. "You did something amazing here tonight." Derek and Victoria left with my parents, Derek giving me a brotherly hug and promising to call me next week to discuss some ideas he had for improving my business model. The hug felt like a performance, another moment in the ongoing show of Derek being the supportive older brother. But I wasn't buying it anymore. After everyone was gone, and Jenna had helped me clean up the worst of the mess, I sat in my car in the parking lot outside the venue, my phone in my hands, and a plan forming in my mind. I was going to investigate Derek. It sounds dramatic when I put it like that, but really it was just common sense. Derek was hiding something, and that something was making him nervous and flush with untraceable cash. As someone who worked in marketing and communications, I knew that people's secrets usually weren't as secret as they thought they were. Digital footprints, social media behavior, public records, all of it left traces that someone who knew how to look could follow. I started with the basics. Derek's social media presence was exactly what you'd expect from someone in his position. Professional photos and carefully curated posts about industry events and weekend activities that suggested a balanced, successful lifestyle. But social media is designed to show the best version of someone's life, and I was looking for the parts Derek didn't want people to see. His LinkedIn profile was updated regularly, showcasing promotions and projects and the kind of professional networking that was part of his job. But when I looked at the timeline of his posts and updates, there were gaps. Periods of several weeks where someone who normally posted multiple times a week went completely silent. I cross-referenced those gaps with his other social media activity and found something interesting. During the times when Derek's professional posting decreased, his personal activity increased, but in strange ways. Check-ins at restaurants and bars in parts of the city he'd never shown interest in before. Photos tagged in locations that didn't match his usual preferences. Comments on posts by people who didn't seem to be part of his normal social or professional circle. It was like Derek was living two different lives, and he was being careful to keep them separate. I spent the weekend digging deeper, using every research technique I'd learned building my business and a few I'd picked up from clients who needed competitive intelligence. I looked at public records, business filings, professional directories, anywhere Derek's name might appear in connection with activities he wasn't advertising, and I found it. Derek Rodriguez, management consultant at Morrison, Blake & Associates, was also Derek Rodriguez, registered business owner of DR Consulting Solutions, a sole proprietorship that had been filed 6 months earlier with the State Business Registry. DR Consulting Solutions was supposed to provide specialized business advisory services to small and medium-sized enterprises. According to the filing, it was Derek's side hustle, a way to leverage his corporate experience to help smaller businesses that couldn't afford big consulting firms, which would have been perfectly legitimate, except for 2 problems. First, Derek's employment contract with Morrison, Blake & Associates specifically prohibited outside consulting work without written approval from the company. I knew this because Derek had complained about it years earlier, when a friend asked him to help with a business plan. Corporate consulting firms were notoriously strict about conflicts of interest and client confidentiality. Second, DR Consulting Solutions wasn't actually helping small businesses. According to the business plan filed with his registration, Derek was targeting the exact same market segment as the big corporate firms. He was positioning himself as a boutique alternative for companies that wanted high-level strategic consulting but preferred to work with smaller, more personalized providers. In other words, Derek was directly competing with his own employer, using inside knowledge and client relationships he'd developed through his day job to build a competing business that could eventually replace his corporate income. It was smart, actually. Brilliantly planned and perfectly positioned to take advantage of current market trends towards smaller, more agile service providers. It was also completely unethical and probably illegal, given his employment contracts and the confidentiality agreements he'd signed. But that wasn't the best part. The best part was Derek's marketing strategy. DR Consulting Solutions had a website, professionally designed and obviously expensive, that positioned Derek as a successful corporate consultant who was choosing to work independently to better serve his clients. Meads. The site featured testimonials from satisfied customers, case studies of successful projects, and a bio that highlighted Derek's MBA and corporate experience without mentioning his current employment. The testimonials were fake. I reverse-searched the photos and found stock photography sites where the supposed client photos had been purchased. The case studies were based on real projects, but they were projects Derek had worked on at Morrison, Blake & Associates, rebranded and presented as his own independent work. Derek wasn't just running a side business, he was committing fraud, stealing intellectual property, and violating about a dozen different professional ethics standards, and he was making a lot of money doing it. The financial information I could access through public records suggested that DR Consulting Solutions had generated over $300,000 in revenue in its first 6 months of operation. No wonder Derek was carrying around rolls of cash and acting nervous about his phone calls. He was living a double life, and if anyone at Morrison, Blake, found out about it, he wouldn't just lose his job. He'd probably face criminal charges and civil lawsuits that would bankrupt him and destroy his professional reputation permanently. I had Derek exactly where I wanted him. The question was, what to do with the information. I could report him to his employer, but that felt too easy, too private. Derek had humiliated me in public, in front of everyone who mattered to me professionally and personally. If I was going to get revenge, it needed to be equally public. I decided to wait for the right opportunity, and Derek gave it to me sooner than I expected. 2 weeks after my grand opening, Derek called to invite me to dinner at Chez Leroy, one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. The kind of place where entrees start at $40 and the wine list requires a second mortgage. "I want to apologize for the other night," Derek said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of big brother concern. "I know my phone call was poorly timed, and I should have been more present for your big moment." It was a good apology, the kind Derek had always been skilled at delivering. Sincere enough to seem real, but vague enough to avoid admitting actual wrongdoing. If I hadn't spent the last 2 weeks uncovering his secret life, I might have been touched by the gesture. "Also," Derek continued, "I've been thinking about your business model, and I have some ideas that might help you scale more effectively. Maybe we could discuss it over dinner? My treat, obviously. My treat." With money he was making by defrauding his employer and his clients. The irony was almost perfect. "That sounds great," I said. "Should I bring Jenna? She handles a lot of our strategic planning." "Actually, let's keep it just family for now. I think you'll find my suggestions pretty significant, and it might be better to discuss them privately first." Significant suggestions. From the man who'd spent my grand opening explaining why my business was essentially a food truck compared to real consulting firms. I couldn't wait to hear what Derek thought I should be doing differently. We met at Chez Leroy on a Thursday evening, Derek arriving 15 minutes late and looking harried in a way that was becoming his trademark. He was dressed impeccably as always, but I could see the stress in the way he kept checking his phone and adjusting his expensive watch. "Sorry," he said, kissing my cheek in greeting. "Client crisis. You know how it is." I did know how it was, actually. I'd spent the last 2 weeks learning exactly how Derek's client crises worked. We were seated at a table near the window, the kind of prime location that probably required connections or significant tips to secure. Derek ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month, and I let him, curious to see how far his performance would go. Derek said after the waiter had gone through the elaborate ritual of wine presentation and approval. "I've been thinking about our conversation at your opening, and I realize I may have come across as condescending isn't the right word, but maybe not as supportive as I should have been." "You think?" I said, taking a sip of wine that probably tasted expensive but mostly just tasted like alcohol to me. "I know, and I want to make it up to you by offering something that could really transform your business." Derek leaned forward, his expression serious and focused in the way that had always made adults take him seriously when we were kids. "I've been talking to some people at my firm about small business development, and there's a real opportunity for companies like yours to partner with larger consulting groups." He paused for effect, the way he always did when he was about to deliver what he thought was particularly impressive news. "I think I could get you a contract as a subcontractor for Morrison Blake. Nothing huge to start. Just small projects that need local market expertise or specialized creative services. But it could be a way for you to access bigger clients and more sophisticated projects." It was a generous offer, the kind of opportunity that could legitimately transform my business. It was also complete bullshit. Derek couldn't get me a contract with Morrison Blake because Derek was actively defrauding Morrison Blake. Any attempt to bring me into his professional world would risk exposing his double life and destroying everything he'd built. But more than that, Derek was offering me exactly what he'd spent my grand opening explaining I should want: the chance to be a subcontractor to real consulting firms, instead of trying to compete with them directly. He was positioning himself as the generous big brother who could open doors I couldn't open myself, while simultaneously reinforcing the narrative that my independent business was inadequate. "That's an interesting offer," I said carefully. "What would you need from me to make something like that happen?" "Well, there would be some changes to your business model. Blake has pretty strict standards for their subcontractors. You'd need to expand your team. Probably hire some people with more traditional business backgrounds. Maybe rebrand a little, make the company feel more corporate and less boutique." There was that word again, boutique, Derek's favorite way of dismissing anything that didn't meet his standards of legitimacy. "You'd also need to be prepared to take direction on projects. Follow their methodologies and reporting structures. It's not like working with local small businesses, where you can be creative and flexible. These are serious clients with serious expectations." Serious client. As opposed to my unserious clients with their unserious local businesses and unserious problems that apparently didn't require serious solutions. Derek continued outlining his vision for transforming my company into something worthy of association with his firm, and with every suggestion it became clearer that what he was really offering was the chance to become a junior partner in his own operation. He would be the connection to Morrison Blake, the one with the relationships and expertise, while I would be the subcontractor who executed his vision under his supervision. It was brilliant, actually. Derek got to expand his legitimate consulting capacity while maintaining plausible deniability about his illegal side business. If anyone questioned how he was generating so much independent revenue, he could point to his sister's company as a subcontracting partner and claim he was simply facilitating business development opportunities. "What do you think?" Derek asked, sitting back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who's just offered a gift they're sure will be appreciated. I thought Derek was even more arrogant and manipulative than I'd realized. I thought his offer was designed to solve his problems while making me dependent on his connections and approval. I thought he was still treating me like the screw-up little sister who should be grateful for any help the successful big brother was willing to provide. But what I said was, "It sounds like something worth exploring. When would you want to set up a meeting?" Derek's face lit up with genuine pleasure, the kind of expression he used to get when we were kids, and he'd successfully talked me into some scheme that would make him look good, and me look foolish. I was hoping he'd say that. "Actually, I've already arranged a preliminary meeting. Next Friday at Morrison, Blake's offices. Just informal, a chance for you to meet some people and get a feel for how they operate." He'd already arranged a meeting. Before even talking to me about the offer, Derek was so confident I'd be grateful for his help that he'd started making plans without bothering to ask if I was interested. "That's very proactive of you," I said. "I know it seems fast, but opportunities like this don't come along often. The Small Business Development Initiative is still in pilot phase, and if you get in early, you could really establish yourself as a preferred partner." A preferred partner. Under Derek's sponsorship and supervision, of course. We spent the rest of dinner discussing logistics and expectations, Derek outlining the impressive client roster I'd have access to, and the professional development opportunities that would come with association to a firm like Morrison, Blake. He was painting a picture of everything I'd supposedly want: career advancement and financial security, and the respect that came with working for prestigious clients. And all I had to do was give up everything that made my business mine. Derek paid for dinner with cash again, peeling bills off a roll thick enough to be its own weapon. As we waited for the valet to bring our cars around, he put his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that was probably meant to be brotherly and supportive. "I'm really excited about this, Maya. I think it could be the beginning of something big for both of us. Of us. Because, of course, Derek's vision of my success still centered around his own benefit. I drove home thinking about the meeting Derek had arranged and the opportunity he was offering, and the way he'd managed to turn my business success into another chapter in his own story of being the generous, successful big brother who lifted up his struggling sister. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd made my decision. I was going to that meeting at Morrison, Blake and Associates, but not for the reasons Derek expected. I was going to destroy him. The Morrison, Blake offices occupied 3 floors of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building that screamed corporate success and intimidated anyone who wasn't dressed appropriately. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing my best business suit and carrying a leather portfolio that had cost more than I wanted to admit, but looked suitably professional. Derek met me in the lobby, looking every inch the successful consultant in his tailored suit and confident smile. He guided me through the security process and up to the 42nd floor, where Morrison, Blake's strategic consulting division, was housed. "Remember," Derek said as we rode the elevator up, "these people are used to working with major corporations and established firms. Just be yourself, but maybe professional version yourself. Professional version myself." As opposed to the unprofessional version Derek apparently thought was my default setting. The Morrison, Blake offices were exactly what I'd expected. All glass and steel and expensive furniture arranged to suggest both success and intimidation. Derek led me through a maze of cubicles and conference rooms to a corner office where 3 people were waiting for us. James Morrison was a partner in the firm. A man in his early 50s with silver hair and the kind of presence that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room. Sandra Blake was younger, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a handshake that could crack bones. The third person was introduced as Michael Chen, a senior associate who specialized in small business development initiatives. "Derek's told us about your company," Morrison said after we'd settled around a conference table that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Rodriguez Creative Solutions, right? Boutique marketing and consulting for local businesses." There was that word again, but coming from Morrison it sounded neutral, descriptive rather than dismissive. I was starting to think Derek's use of boutique said more about Derek than about industry terminology. "That's right," I said. "We focus on small to medium-sized businesses that need strategic marketing support but want more personalized service than they'd get from larger agencies." "Interesting niche," Blake said. "Derek mentioned you'd been growing pretty rapidly." "We have. We started 18 months ago with just me, and now we have 4 full-time employees and more clients than we can handle with our current capacity." It was true, and saying it out loud reminded me how much I'd accomplished, how proud I should be of what I'd built instead of sitting here pretending to be grateful for Derek's condescending offer to make me legitimate. "That's impressive growth," Chen said, making notes on a tablet. "What's your average project value?" I gave them the numbers, explaining our service offerings and pricing structure, our client retention rates and referral percentages. The questions were intelligent and professional, and I found myself relaxing into the conversation, talking about my business with people who understood the industry and could appreciate what I'd accomplished. Derek sat quietly through most of the discussion, occasionally adding context or clarification, playing the role of supportive colleague facilitating a mutually beneficial introduction. But I could see him checking his phone under the table. That same nervous energy I'd noticed at my grand opening. "The subcontracting opportunity Derek mentioned is part of a new initiative we're piloting," Morrison explained. "We're finding that some of our larger clients need specialized services that fall outside our core competencies. Local market research, culturally specific marketing strategies, small business supply chain, analysis, that kind of thing. It would be project-based work initially," Blake added. "But if the partnership works well, there could be opportunities for more extensive collaboration." They outlined the structure they had in mind, the reporting requirements and quality standards, the types of projects that might be suitable for subcontracting. It was exactly what Derek had described over dinner, an opportunity to access bigger clients and more sophisticated projects under the supervision and guidance of Morrison, Blake's established expertise. It was also exactly the kind of opportunity I would have jumped at 6 months ago, before I'd built enough confidence to believe my business could succeed on its own terms. "This all sounds very interesting," I said. "I'd need to review the specific contract terms and discuss it with my team, but I'm definitely open to exploring a partnership." Morrison smiled, the kind of expression successful people wear when they're about to offer someone a significant opportunity. "Excellent. Derek, why don't you work with Maya on the preliminary documentation? We can schedule a follow-up meeting once she's had a chance to review everything." Derek nodded, his professional smile perfectly in place, but I could see relief in his eyes. The meeting was going exactly as he'd planned, his sister appropriately grateful for the opportunity he'd arranged, his colleagues impressed by his initiative in identifying potential partners. "Actually," I said, my voice casual and conversational, "I'm curious about something. Derek mentioned that Blake has been exploring small business development for a while. Have you worked with many boutique consulting firms in the past?" It was an innocent question, the kind of background research any smart business owner would do before entering into a partnership. But I could see Derek's posture change slightly, a tension in his shoulders that suggested he wasn't sure where I was going with this. "Not extensively," Morrison said. "We've done some limited partnerships, mostly with specialized firms that have expertise we don't maintain in-house. Technology consultants, regulatory specialists, that sort of thing." "What about independent consultants? People who've left larger firms to start their own practices?" Blake and Chen exchanged glances, the kind of look that suggested this was a sensitive topic. "We're always interested in working with qualified independent contractors," Blake said carefully. "But we have pretty strict guidelines about conflicts of interest and confidentiality. Anyone who's worked for a competing firm would need to go through extensive vetting to ensure there weren't any ethical issues." "That makes sense," I said. "I imagine there are a lot of people in the industry who try to leverage their corporate connections inappropriately." Derek's face had gone very still, his professional smile frozen in place like a mask. He was smart enough to recognize that this conversation had taken a dangerous turn, but not sure how to redirect it without making things worse. "Unfortunately, yes," Morrison said, his tone suggesting this was something he'd dealt with before. "We've had situations where former employees or competitors have tried to use inside information or client relationships inappropriately. It's one of the reasons we're so careful about due diligence." "Have you ever had issues with current employees running side businesses?" I asked, my voice still conversational, still innocent. I imagine that would be even more problematic. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Morrison and Blake were looking at me with the sharp attention that suggested they were wondering why I was asking such specific questions. Chen had stopped taking notes and was staring at Derek with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That would be extremely problematic," Morrison said slowly. "Any Morrison, Blake employee who was running an independent consulting practice would be in violation of their employment contract and potentially facing criminal charges for fraud and theft of intellectual property." Derek's face had gone pale, his hands gripping the edge of the conference table hard enough that his knuckles were white. He was smart enough to know exactly where this was heading, but trapped by the situation he'd created. He couldn't shut down the conversation without looking suspicious, but every word was making his position more precarious. "I'm sure it doesn't happen often," I said. "It would take someone pretty arrogant to think they could get away with something like that." "Or desperate," Blake added. "We've found that people who engage in that kind of behavior are usually facing financial pressures or career disappointments that make them willing to take risks they wouldn't normally consider." I pulled out my phone, opening the browser to a page I'd bookmarked weeks earlier. "Actually, I came across an interesting example while I was researching potential competitors. There's this company called DR Consulting Solutions that seems to be targeting the same market as larger firms but positioning itself as a boutique alternative." Derek's breathing had become audible, shallow and rapid, like someone trying not to panic. Morrison, Blake, and Chen were looking at my phone screen with the kind of focused attention that suggested they were very interested in what I was showing them. "The interesting thing is that the case studies on their website look really familiar," I continued, scrolling through the DR Consulting Solutions site. "In fact, they look exactly like projects that Morrison Blake has featured in your own marketing materials." I turned my phone so everyone could see the screen, displaying the side-by-side comparison I'd prepared showing Derek's stolen case studies next to Morrison, Blake's original project descriptions. The silence in the room was deafening. Morrison was the first to speak, his voice deadly quiet. "Derek, would you like to explain why your sister is showing us what appears to be intellectual property theft?" Derek opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For the first time in his life, the golden boy who always had the right answer, the perfect explanation, the charming deflection, had absolutely nothing to say. This is Maya. Why are you doing this?" It was the question I'd been waiting for him to ask. "Because you humiliated me in front of everyone who matters to me," I said, my voice steady and calm. "Because you spent my grand opening explaining to potential clients why my business was essentially a food truck compared to real consulting firms. Because you brought me here today planning to turn my company into a subsidiary of your fraud operation while making me grateful for the privilege." I turned to Morrison, Blake, and Chen, who were staring at Derek like they were seeing him for the first time. Derek Rodriguez registered DR Consulting Solutions 6 months ago as a sole proprietorship, according to his business plan. He's providing strategic consulting services to mid-size companies using methodologies and case studies he developed while working here. He's generated over $300,000 in revenue so far, all while maintaining his full-time position and claiming to work exclusively for Morrison, Blake. Derek's face had gone from pale to grey, his eyes darting between me and his colleagues like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. The testimonials on his website are fake, purchased stock photos with fabricated quotes. The case studies are your intellectual property, rebranded and presented as his own independent work. And the clients he's serving are companies that could have been Morrison, Blake clients if they'd known about your services. Morrison's expression had moved past anger into something cold and calculating. Blake was taking notes rapidly, her pen moving across paper with aggressive efficiency. Chen was photographing my phone screen with his own device, documenting the evidence I'd presented. "Derek, is this true?" Morrison asked. Derek looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between betrayal and desperate pleading. He was realizing that his perfect life, his golden boy reputation, his entire carefully constructed identity was crumbling in real time. "James, I can explain. This isn't what it looks like. She's exaggerating. She doesn't understand the consulting industry. She's taking things out of context." But his explanation sounded hollow even to him, the desperate deflections of someone who'd been caught and knew it. "The business registration documents are public record," I said. "The website is live right now. The financial information is filed with the state. There's nothing out of context about documentation Derek filed himself." Blake looked up from her notes. "Derek, you understand that what you're describing constitutes fraud, theft of intellectual property, violation of your employment contract, and breach of fiduciary duty to this firm and our clients?" Derek was staring at the table, his perfect composure finally completely shattered. "I was going to tell you. I was developing a proposal for how Morrison, Blake, could expand into the small business market. This was research, market validation for a potential new service line. It was a good lie, the kind of creative explanation Derek had always been skilled at constructing. But it was also obviously false, contradicted by months of documentation and business activity that told a completely different story. "Research that generated $300,000 in personal revenue?" Morrison asked. "Market validation that required you to steal our intellectual property and compete directly with our client base?" Derek had no answer for that, because there was no answer that could possibly justify what he'd done. Morrison stood up, his movement sharp and final. "Derek, you're terminated immediately. Security will escort you out of the building. You can expect to hear from our legal department regarding recovery of stolen intellectual property and damages to the firm. And you can expect a call from the State Attorney General's office," Blake added. "What you've done here isn't just a violation of company policy. It's criminal fraud." Derek looked around the room one more time, his eyes finally settling on me. The expression on his face was something I'd never seen before, a mixture of rage and disbelief, and something that might have been respect. "You planned this," he said. "All of it. The meeting, the questions, the evidence. You've been planning this for weeks." "I've been planning this since you walked out of my grand opening to take a phone call and told everyone it was your sister's little event," said. "You humiliated me in front of everyone who mattered to me. And you did it because you thought I was too small and too stupid to fight back." Derek shook his head, still trying to process what had just happened. "Maya, you don't understand what you've done. This isn't just about me. Mom and Dad, our family. Everyone's going to know about this. You've destroyed everything. No, I said. You destroyed everything. I just made sure everyone found out about it. Security arrived then. 2 professional-looking men who escorted Derek out of the conference room with the kind of efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first time removing someone from the building. Derek went quietly, his fight finally gone, leaving behind only the echoes of his perfect reputation crashing down around him. Morrison, Blake, and Chen sat in silence for several minutes after Derek was gone, processing what had just happened and probably wondering how they'd missed such extensive fraud happening under their own roof. Ms. Rodriguez, Morrison finally said, I want to apologize for bringing you into this situation. Derek's actions reflect poorly on this firm, and you shouldn't have been put in the position of having to expose them. Actually, I said, I'm glad I could help. Derek's been stealing from you for months, and it would have continued if someone hadn't brought it to light. Blake looked up from her notes. Can I ask why you chose to handle it this way? You could have reported Derek's activities directly to us, or to law enforcement. Why the public confrontation? It was a fair question, and I'd been expecting it. Because Derek didn't just steal from Morrison, Blake. He stole from me too. He took my moment of professional triumph and turned it into an opportunity to demonstrate his superiority. He used my business as a prop in his own performance, and then offered to help me become legitimate by making me a subsidiary of his fraud operation. I paused, looking around the room at 3 people who were clearly successful, clearly respected, clearly everything Derek had pretended to be. Derek spent my entire life treating me like I was too small and too stupid to matter. He was counting on me being too grateful for his help to ask difficult questions, too naive to recognize what he was really offering, too intimidated by his success to challenge his authority. And you wanted to prove him wrong, Chen said. I wanted to prove that the screw-up little sister he'd been condescending to for 28 years was smart enough to destroy him when he finally went too far. Morrison smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him since the meeting started. Well, you certainly accomplished that. We spent another hour discussing the situation, with Morrison, Blake, and Chen asking detailed questions about Derek's activities and the evidence I'd gathered. They were thorough and professional, treating me as a valuable witness rather than an accomplice, and by the time we were finished, I felt like I'd finally been taken seriously by people who understood the business world Derek had always claimed I couldn't navigate. Ms. Rodriguez, Morrison said as we prepared to leave, I want you to know that Derek's behavior doesn't change our interest in potentially working with your company. What you've accomplished with Rodriguez Creative Solutions is impressive, and the way you handled this situation demonstrates exactly the kind of strategic thinking and attention to detail we value in our partners. It was generous of him to say, and probably true, but I realized I didn't need Morrison, Blake's validation anymore. I'd built something good without their help, and I could continue building it without their approval. I appreciate that, I said, but I think Rodriguez Creative Solutions is doing fine on its own. We're not really looking for partnerships right now. Blake smiled. Fair enough, but if you change your mind, you know where to find us. I left the Morrison, Blake offices feeling lighter than I had in months. Like a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had finally been lifted from my shoulders. Derek's power over me, his ability to make me feel small and inadequate, had been built on the assumption that he was everything he claimed to be, and I was everything he said I was. But Derek wasn't the golden boy. He was a fraud and a thief who'd been living on borrowed time and stolen accomplishments, and I wasn't the screw-up little sister who needed his help to succeed. I was the business owner who'd built something real and honest and entirely my own. My phone started ringing before I made it to the parking garage. Derek's number, which I declined to answer. Then Victoria's number, which I also declined. Then my mother's number, which I probably should have answered but didn't feel ready for yet. The voicemails came in rapid succession, each one more desperate than the last. Derek begging me to call him back, explaining that I didn't understand what I'd done, promising that he could fix everything if I would just give him a chance. Victoria asking what had happened and why Derek was talking about lawyers and criminal charges. My mother wanting to know why Derek had called her crying and whether I knew anything about problems at his work. I deleted them all without listening to them completely. I drove back to my office, where Jenna was waiting with a concerned expression and a dozen questions about how the meeting had gone. I told her everything, from Derek's fraudulent business to the confrontation at Morrison, Blake to the way Derek's perfect facade had crumbled when he realized he'd been caught. "Oh my God," Jenna said when I finished. "You actually did it. You took down the goal you took down. How do you feel?" It was a good question. How did I feel? Vindicated. Certainly. Satisfied that Derek had finally faced consequences for treating people badly. Proud that I'd been smart enough and strong enough to fight back when he underestimated me. But also sad in a way I hadn't expected. Derek was still my brother, and watching him fall had been brutal even when it was deserved. Our relationship had always been complicated, built on a foundation of competition and comparison that had shaped both our lives in ways that probably weren't healthy. "I feel like I finally stood up for myself," I said. The fallout was swift and comprehensive. Derek's termination from Morrison, Blake made the local business news within days, along with reports about the criminal investigation into his fraudulent consulting practice. DR Consulting Solutions was shut down by court order, its assets frozen while attorneys sorted through the legal implications of Derek's theft. Derek himself disappeared from social media, his professional profiles deleted or made private, his usual confident posting replaced by complete silence. Victoria posted a carefully worded statement about ending their relationship and focusing on her own career, the kind of professional damage control that suggested she'd consulted with lawyers before putting anything in writing. My parents called repeatedly, wanting explanations and mediation, and some way to fix the family crisis that had erupted without warning. I eventually answered, listening to my mother cry about how Derek's life was ruined, and my father worry about criminal charges and legal fees they couldn't afford. "How could you do this to your own brother?" my mother asked during one particularly difficult conversation. "Whatever Derek did, family should come first. We should have handled this privately." It was the reaction I'd expected, the instinctive protection of the golden child who'd always been the family's pride and source of reflected glory. But it still hurt, hearing my mother prioritize Derek's reputation over the fact that he'd spent years treating me badly and recently committed actual crimes. "Derek made his choices," I said. "I just made sure there were consequences for them. But now everyone knows," my mother said. "Everyone in our community, everyone at church, everyone who knew Derek was successful. How is he supposed to recover from this? Maybe he should have thought about that before he decided to build his success on stolen work and fraudulent business practices. Maya, please. He's your brother. Can't you find some way to help him through this? The answer was no. Derek had spent our entire lives positioning himself as the successful one, and me as the failure, and when he finally achieved the success he'd always craved, it turned out to be built on lies and theft. I wasn't responsible for cleaning up his mess, and I wasn't going to sacrifice my own hard-earned reputation to protect his. Derek's an adult, I said. He can handle the consequences of his own actions. But the family pressure was intense and constant, a steady stream of calls and messages asking me to reconsider, to find some way to minimize the damage, to remember that blood was thicker than water and family loyalty should trump everything else. It might have worked 6 months earlier. The old Maya, the one who'd spent her life believing she was the screw-up who should be grateful for Derek's attention, might have found a way to help him avoid the worst consequences of his actions. But the new Maya, the one who'd built a successful business and finally learned to stand up for herself, wasn't interested in enabling Derek's behavior any longer. Rodriguez's creative solutions thrived in the aftermath of the scandal. The story of how I'd exposed my brother's fraud became something of a legend in local business circles, positioning me as someone who was smart, principled, and tough enough to do the right thing even when it was difficult. New clients approached us regularly, often mentioning that they'd heard about the Morrison-Blake situation and were impressed by how I'd handled it. My existing clients seemed more confident in our services, knowing that they were working with someone who had enough integrity to turn in her own brother when he was breaking the law. We hired 2 more employees, moved into a larger office space, and started turning down projects because we had more opportunities than we could handle. Everything I'd dreamed of when I started the company was finally happening, and it was happening because I'd refused to let Derek diminish my accomplishments or co-opt my success for his own benefit. Derek tried to contact me several times in the months that followed, leaving voicemails that ranged from angry to pleading to devastatingly sad. He was facing criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and complete professional destruction. His reputation was ruined, his career was over, and his personal relationships had crumbled along with everything else. I listened to the messages, but never returned his calls. Derek had made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. I felt sorry for him, in a way, but I didn't feel responsible for fixing the problems he'd created for himself. The criminal case took almost a year to resolve, ending with Derek pleading guilty to fraud and theft charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. He served 6 months in minimum security prison and was ordered to pay restitution to Morrison, Blake, and the clients he'd defrauded. I didn't attend his sentencing hearing, though my parents begged me to show family support. Derek had never shown support for me when it mattered, and I wasn't interested in performing family loyalty for the benefit of people who'd never questioned his treatment of me. But I did read about it in the local business journal, where Derek's fall from grace was covered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of corporate fraud and the importance of ethical business practices. The article mentioned that his own sister had been the one to expose his crimes, a detail that probably hurt Derek more than the prison sentence or financial penalties. Good. He deserved to hurt. 2 years after the Morrison-Blake meeting, Rodriguez's creative solutions had grown into everything I'd hoped it could become. We had 12 employees, an office suite in the downtown business district, and a client roster that included some of the most respected companies in the region. I was featured on the cover of Business Monthly as one of the city's rising entrepreneurs, with a story that detailed how I'd built my company from nothing into a major player in the local marketing industry. The article mentioned the Derek situation briefly, positioning it as an example of how principled business practices and personal integrity could triumph over corruption and fraud. Derek wasn't mentioned by name in the article, but anyone who knew the story would understand the reference. I hoped he saw it, I hoped it reminded him that while his fraudulent success had crumbled into nothing, my honest success had grown into something real and lasting. My parents eventually stopped pressuring me to reconcile with Derek, though they never stopped hoping that time would heal the rift between us. They attended my company's second anniversary celebration, looking proud and slightly bewildered by how much I'd accomplished. "I always knew you were smart," my father said, hugging me after my speech to the gathered clients and employees. "But I didn't know you were this smart." It was a nice thing to say, even if it wasn't entirely true. My parents had known I was smart, but they'd also known Derek was smarter, or at least more successful in ways they understood and valued. It had taken watching Derek's success revealed as fraudulent for them to fully appreciate what I'd built honestly. Derek was released from prison after serving 4 months of his 6-month sentence, and he moved back in with our parents while he tried to rebuild his life. I heard updates occasionally, usually from my mother, who hoped that sharing Derek's struggles would inspire me to reach out and offer support. Derek was working at a small accounting firm, doing basic bookkeeping for a fraction of what he'd earned at Morrison, Blake. He was living in his childhood bedroom, driving a used car he'd bought with money borrowed from our parents, and trying to piece together some kind of future from the wreckage of his former life. It sounded miserable, and probably was. But it was also honest work that didn't involve stealing from his employer or defrauding clients, which represented significant progress for Derek. I never reached out to him, and he eventually stopped trying to contact me. We settled into a cold peace where we existed in the same family without having any direct relationship, our parents serving as reluctant intermediaries when coordination was absolutely necessary. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than the alternative, where Derek continued to treat me as his inadequate little sister, while building his success on lies and theft. 5 years after exposing Derek's fraud, I was invited to speak at a conference on business ethics and entrepreneurship. The organizers wanted me to tell the story of how I'd discovered and reported my brother's crimes, positioning it as an example of how personal integrity could triumph over family loyalty when the two came into conflict. I accepted the invitation, partly because it was good for business, and partly because I wanted to tell the story one more time, to make sure people understood that what Derek had done wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment, but a pattern of behavior that had been building for years. The audience was mostly young entrepreneurs and business students, people who were just starting their careers and needed to understand that success built on dishonesty was never sustainable. I told them about Derek's golden boy reputation, his condescending attitude toward my business, and his assumption that I would be too grateful and too naive to question his motives. "The most important lesson I learned," I concluded, "is that you can't let other people define your worth based on their own insecurities and limitations." Derek spent our entire lives making me feel small because it made him feel big. But when I finally stood up for myself and demanded to be treated with respect, I discovered that I was stronger and smarter than either of us had realized. After my speech, a young woman approached me during the networking reception, her business card identifying her as a recent MBA graduate who was starting her own consulting firm. "I wanted to thank you for telling that story," she said. "I have an older brother who's always made me feel like I'm not smart enough or successful enough to compete in business. Hearing how you stood up to yours gives me hope that I can stand up to mine." It was exactly the kind of response I'd hoped for, confirmation that telling my story publicly could help other people recognize and resist the kind of treatment I'd accepted from Derek for too many years. "The hardest part," I told her, "is realizing that you don't need their approval to succeed. Once you stop trying to prove yourself to people who are determined to see you as inadequate, you can focus on building something real and lasting and entirely your own." She nodded, her expression serious and determined. That's what I'm trying to do. It's scary, starting something from nothing, but it's also exciting to know that whatever I build will be mine. It is yours, I said, and nobody can take that away from you, no matter how hard they try. I drove home from the conference thinking about that conversation, and about how much my life had changed since the night Derek walked out of my grand opening to take a phone call. I'd built something I was proud of, surrounded myself with people who respected and valued my work, and learned to trust my own judgment instead of constantly seeking validation from people who had never believed in me, anyway. Derek was still working at the accounting firm, still living with our parents, still trying to rebuild a life that would never again include the kind of success and recognition he'd once taken for granted. He'd lost everything that had made him feel superior to me, and in losing it, he'd given me the opportunity to discover everything that made me strong. It wasn't the ending either of us had expected when we were growing up, when everyone assumed Derek would be the successful one, and I would be the one who needed help and guidance and patient explanation of how the world really worked. But it was the ending we'd both earned through our choices and actions, and I was finally comfortable with my role in that story. Rodriguez Creative Solutions continued to grow and evolve, becoming the kind of company I'd only dreamed about when I started working out of my bedroom with one client and a website I'd built myself. We moved into a building we owned rather than rented, hired employees with advanced degrees and impressive resumes, and started turning away potential clients because we had more opportunities than we could handle. I was featured in magazines, invited to speak at conferences, and recognized as one of the region's most successful young entrepreneurs. People who had once dismissed my business as a boutique operation were now studying our methods and trying to understand how we'd grown so quickly while maintaining such high client satisfaction rates. None of it would have happened if Derek hadn't underestimated me so completely that he thought he could use my business as a prop in his fraudulent consulting operation. His arrogance had given me the motivation I needed to investigate his activities, and his condescension had given me the courage I needed to expose them publicly. In trying to make me small, Derek had forced me to become larger than either of us had imagined possible, and in trying to co-opt my success for his own benefit, he'd given me the opportunity to achieve success that was entirely, authentically, and permanently mine. I never thanked him for that, but maybe someday I would.